People think heartbreak changes you overnight, but it really doesn't. What changes you is what happens after everybody leaves. When you're alone with your thoughts, your habits, your pain, and the version of yourself you can't avoid anymore. After the breakup, I wish I could tell you I immediately got my life together, but I didn't. Honestly, I got worse before I got better. Because even after the relationship officially ended, we were still living together. The same apartment, the same tension, the same emotional chaos every single day. And that kind of environment will destroy your mental health if you stay in it too long. There's no real closure when somebody is still physically present in your life every day. You can't heal, you can't think clearly, and you can't emotionally detach, especially when betrayal is involved. I remember a lot of times constantly feeling on edge. Every little thing irritated me, and a lot of conversations felt tense. And the worst part is I didn't even recognize myself anymore. I was becoming somebody angry, reactive, and extremely emotionally unstable. Not because that's who I truly was, but because unresolved pain eventually leaks out somewhere if you never actually do process it. And that's something a lot of people really don't understand. Pain doesn't disappear because you ignore it. It just transforms. Sometimes into anger, sometimes into depression, sometimes into addiction, sometimes into emotional numbness. Mine turned into emotional chaos, and eventually I hit a point where I couldn't even stay in the apartment anymore. I remember having to leave for a while to stay with a friend just to clear my head. I needed space, I needed silence, and I needed to get away from the emotional confusion long enough to think. But even then, I still wasn't healing correctly. I was distracting myself, working constantly, driving around endlessly, and keeping noise around me. Anything to avoid sitting still with my thoughts. Because sitting still meant confronting reality, and that reality hurt. I had to face the fact that the relationship I fought so hard to save was already broken long before it actually ended. I also had to sit there and face the fact that I ignored the warning signs because I was terrified of abandonment. And hardest of all, I had to face who I had become inside that relationship. And that part mattered. Because while, yes, I had been lied to, manipulated, and betrayed, I had to take accountability for myself. My anger, my emotional reactions, my inability to communicate properly when hurt, and the way I just exploded instead of expressing pain calmly. Healing requires honesty, real, genuine honesty, not just pointing at what others did to you. And that season forced me into that kind of self-reflection, whether I wanted it or not. And eventually we came to an agreement to stay out of each other's way while figuring out how to separate completely. But even that became messy. Nothing about the situation was clean emotionally. There were still arguments, still resentment, and still unresolved wounds. And then another truth came out that pushed me even further mentally. One night, a friend texted me asking if I knew she was still promoting the OnlyFans account we had made together. And that honestly completely blindsided me. Because I was under the impression that it was deleted, done, over with. And more importantly, I had specifically asked her to remove anything involving me after the breakup. Not out of spite, not out of respect. I wanted separation, closure, and privacy. And realizing that wasn't happening hurt, honestly, kind of deeply. And it wasn't because of jealousy, but because it reinforced something I was slowly realizing throughout that entire relationship. I had kept trusting words that didn't align with actions. And that realization does change you, because eventually you stop questioning isolated incidents and start questioning the entire foundation of the relationship itself. And I confronted her about it, and of course it turned into another argument, another explosion, another emotionally exhausting night where both people were hurt and defensive. But underneath all the anger, there was another emotion hiding inside of me too. Grief. Not just grief over losing her, but grief over losing the future I imagined. Grief over the version of life that I thought I was building. Grief over the years emotionally invested into something that collapsed. And people underestimate how painful that is, especially for men. Because more often than not, men are taught to suppress heartbreak instead of actually process it, to distract instead of heal, to move on quickly instead of reflect deeply. So that's what many of us do. We work more, drink more, sleep around, and stay busy. Anything except actually dealing with the wound. But eventually your soul catches up to you. I know mine did. And then I remember when May finally arrived and she moved out, and I had spent months waiting for that moment, thinking freedom would instantly fix everything, thinking once she was gone, peace would magically return. But when the apartment finally emptied, it was quiet in a way that I wasn't prepared for. And I remember sitting there looking around at the emptiness. No arguing, no noise, no tension, just silence. And honestly, that silence was terrifying at first, because for the first time in years, there were no distractions left. No relationships to focus on, no chaos to manage, and no emotional tug-of-war consuming my attention. It was just me. And when you finally reach that point, you're forced to confront the person staring back at you in the mirror. That's when real change started. Not overnight, not dramatically, slowly and painfully. I started walking my dog Shag almost every day after work, and those walks became therapy for me. No music sometimes, no distractions, just me thinking, reflecting, questioning everything about my life. Who I was, why I kept ending up in unhealthy situations, why abandonment affected me so deeply, and why validation mattered so much to me, and why I tolerated emotional instability for so long. And eventually those questions led me deeper into myself than I had ever gone before. I started reconnecting with God again, not performatively and not perfectly, but more genuinely. Because when everything else stripped away, faith was really one of the only things I had left holding me together. I had started attending church more consistently, I started studying more, and I started trying to rebuild discipline in healthier ways. And at the same time, I worked constantly, 7 days a week again. Construction during the day and driving for Lyft on the weekends. And not because I was trying to escape anymore, but because I was trying to honestly rebuild. And then I think that's different, because one comes from avoidance and the other comes from purpose. And somewhere during that season, I realized something important. The breakup wasn't the end of my story. It was the collapse of a version of myself that could no longer survive. The insecure version, the emotionally reactive person, and the approval-seeking version. That version of me had to break apart for something healthier to eventually grow. And don't get me wrong, healing wasn't linear. There was still a lot of lonely nights. There was still a lot of anger and confusion, and moments where I really did question everything. But little by little, I started becoming more self-aware, more intentional, more grounded. I stopped chasing distractions and started pursuing and understanding instead. And that's when everything truly began changing internally. Because healing doesn't start when the pain leaves. Healing starts when you finally stop running from yourself.